We will now slow to a crawl to discuss traffic on 495 and 270. And we're going to get a briefing today from council staff and the planning board staff. As I think most everyone knows, the governor has announced his intent to expand 270 and 495. He's put forward a vision of adding 2 lanes in each direction to both highways. And that is a pretty significant proposal that is working its way through the process of soliciting RFP responses. But the county council has long been on record with a recommendation for adding capacity to 270 and the spur of 495 all the way to the border with Virginia. And so we're going to have a chance today to get an update from council staff about what they know of the governor's proposal, and we'll also discuss the council's longstanding master plan vision. And I want to note that we did invite the Secretary of State Highway Administration to be here. And they did not want to have that conversation at this time, and so we're nevertheless taking the opportunity here to have our own dialogue and prepare for the next step. And I'll turn it to the chair of the Transportation Committee, Mr. Berliner.
Thank you, Council President. First time this came to at least my attention was a conversation with Mr. Anderson before the T&E committee, in which we understood that our park and planning people are more formally engaged in this process than our county by virtue of the decisions that have to be made. And therefore, park and planning would be, quote, signing off on certain things that perhaps the council has a different view of. And so the question fundamentally from my perspective as T&E and suggesting that we have this conversation is, what's the role of park and planning vis-a-vis the county council? And should park and planning submit, for example, anything it proposes to the council for its review to make sure that anything that park and planning signs off on is something consistent with the council's view of what ought to happen? So that, to me, was the fundamental purpose of this conversation, was to understand their role, our role, the county's role with respect to reviewing this proposal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berliner. Mr. Leventhal.
I just want to say I'm not disappointed with anyone here, but given the publicity around this, I was under the impression that the state of Maryland might be giving us a briefing. So I'm a little surprised and disappointed to find, not disappointed with anyone here, but I don't find that even when Secretary Ron came here at our request, that there's been really any dialogue at all. I don't know if Mr. Leggett, and we'll hear about this, I guess, from County DOT, but to what extent is local government in dialogue or in conversation about this? Is the state proceeding entirely on its own? There's all kinds of implications for neighborhoods and neighborhood traffic and homes, and I mean, we had briefings on the Purple Line repeatedly under many administrations, Ehrlich and O'Malley and Hogan. This is a project which is larger in scale and cost than the Purple Line, and yet as we're not getting briefed by the state, and there hasn't been any consultative process as far as I'm aware. So I guess I naively assumed that we were going to hear from the state. I was like, oh, good, let's hear what their plans are. That's apparently not the case, so that's disappointing.
Yeah, we invited them, and they declined to join us for this discussion today. And not only that, but I think Mr. Owen will explain, there's been some changes in the federal process, where the federal process might have normally been a 5 or 6 year process, and apparently now could be as short as 2 years. So there's a lot of, fast-moving planning happening, and we want to be right at the table. So today's discussion is part of that agenda. So Mr. Owen, could you also include in your comments here just a detailed explanation of what the State Highways said in response to our invitation? Mr. Hucker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, yeah, since Mr. Thought I was going to do this later, but since Mr. Leventhal opened the door, just speaking for my own constituents, I feel like it's incredibly irresponsible that the state is not here. And as much as I love to see all of your faces every morning, especially the first morning back, and yours too, Sydney, I think the timing gives credence to the sense the public has that regardless of the merits of this, and this will be thoroughly debated on the merits, the timing, people certainly have the impression that this is a cynical political exercise that gives the administration the appearance of doing something bold and innovative about Beltway traffic in the fourth year of their administration while leaving all the thorny details till after the election. And unfortunately, I feel like it's having the opposite effect because it has sown so much discord and anxiety in the community. People, neighborhood listservs that are normally talking about backyard barbecues are talking about which houses are going to be taken. And people are very nervous about what's going to happen to their neighborhood, their individual homes, their hospital. In the case of Holy Cross Hospital, people stop me in the grocery store wanting to know, what I know, and they're laying bets on which of their neighbors is going to lose their home. And that's not good for any of us, and I don't believe it's really good for the governor. They were temporarily elated when he said on camera that no homes would be taken, and I think we should hold them to that. But then he's apparently tried to back away from those remarks. So I'm eager to hear from all of you, but I think, Mr. Leventhal, it certainly lends credence to the impression that people have that the timing of this, at least, is driven by the politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hucker. All right, Glenn, you'll begin the presentation.
Good morning. Thank you. We have with us today, by the way, Casey Anderson, Chair of the Planning Board, Gwen Marcus, Planning Director of Park and Planning.
Right.
What did I say?
about,
Did I say Marcus?
It's been about 21 years.
I remember when you were just that, Gwen Wright. She was Gwen Marcus a long time ago. Carol Rubin is the acting deputy director and also manager of the study from the park and planning standpoint, and Chris Conklin is the deputy director for transportation policy for County DOT. Just a little bit of background first. The county's position, to the extent it has a position so far on 270 and 495 historically, is this. On 495, the master plan allows for the widening of the Beltway by one lane in each direction from the west spur, where the west spur of 270 meets the Beltway, over to Virginia. And those two lanes, the one lane in each direction, would either be an HOV lane, high occupancy vehicle lane, or a high occupancy toll lane. That's it. That's all the improvements that are called for in the master plan that are of a major sort that would be master plan eligible. For 270, the county's position, this is both the executive and the county council position, was last taken actually 9 years ago at the end of the I-270 US 15 multimodal corridor study, which also looked at 270 but also looked at the Corridor Cities Transway. The recommendation was that we add 2 lanes to 270 north of 370 up to the county line, and that those 2 lanes in the middle would be reversible, be southbound in the morning, northbound in the evening, and they would be restricted to either HOV or HOT. And there was a further provision that even by doing that, we had to make sure that the general use lanes in the long term did not fall below level of service D. Those are the positions of the county at this point. I know that last position for 270 is 9 years old. The Beltway widening in the west section in the master plan, that was a master plan that was adopted about 15, 16 years ago. The state has had a capital Beltway corridor study for more than 2 decades. It's mostly been dormant. It's risen up now and then. Of course, it's rising up again with this study. 270, as I mentioned, there was the I-270 US 15 study that went all the way to Frederick. It sort of died on the vine in 2009, 2010, after everyone gave their recommendations and sat for many, many years. In passing, of course, there is the Innovative Congestion Management Study, which was done early on in this administration by State Highway. They've come to conclusions what they're going to do, and some of those projects are under construction. None of those improvements are really counter to the current master plan, because those improvements to I-270, which is the $100 million study that you recall, are things like ramp metering, extending acceleration lanes, deceleration lanes, very short sections of widenings in the collector distributor lanes just to improve flow between one interchange and the next. Relatively minor improvements, not mainline widening of the road beyond the 12 lanes that are there in the lower section. Okay, so that's where we are in terms of master plans. In terms of correspondence between this county and the state, the T&E committee wrote to Pete and Ron, Secretary of Transportation, back last fall, asking that the I-270 study be concluded, and the council reiterated T&E committee reiterated the council's position on that. And essentially, Mr. Ron wrote back essentially acknowledging the letter, but saying that there would be this more detailed study which would look at more than that. And then in the spring, the state announced that it was going to split the I-270 and 495 studies into two parts. The part that's being undertaken now is all of the Beltway and I-270, but only as far north as I-370. And the piece of I-270 from I-370 all the way north to the city of Frederick was going to wait for a later study. In that case, there was a letter that was sent by a joint letter by the two county executives and the two council presidents of Montgomery and Frederick County to the secretary saying, no, keep it all together. How can you figure out what the effect of one is without looking at both? The response was that typically in the NEPA process, you don't have a project as large as the entire Beltway and all of 270, and so they needed to break it up, and that the second study, the follow-up study for the piece of the northern part of 270, would start in next year, 2019. Earlier communications didn't say when it would start. So that's the background. Then this past spring, the studies began in earnest. There were workshops held in the communities, and several communities in Montgomery and Prince George's County. And over the course of this spring and the summer, a purpose and needs statement was created. The state has received comments from most everyone by now, including from Park and Planning and from County DOT, as to what should be included in the purpose and need. And when we get a little later with Carol and Chris's part of the presentation, they'll talk a little bit about their comments there. But essentially, the comment period for the purpose and need statement is essentially over. The next stage is the development, the unveiling, if you will, of what's called preliminary alternatives. And these are the 15 alternatives that you've seen or read about. There's actually 15 alternatives and 4 sub-options, so there's really more like 19. These are, I want to characterize them as essentially throwing spaghetti against the wall, see what sticks. If you recall the Intercounty Connector study, at this stage of the process, there were dozens of preliminary alternatives. You would go to a public meeting in 2003, and you'd see a map on the wall with lines everywhere. The idea is that under NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, you have to look, at least initially, at any possible plausible alternative. And so many of these alternatives that are put out there are, in fact, they all are really generic alternatives. I don't believe really any serious engineering has been done on any of them. I've talked with the state folks about it. They didn't want to come down today because, frankly, they didn't want to get engaged too much in these preliminary alternatives because they thought the real focus ought to be once they get down to the next stage, which is winnowing those down to a smaller set. I'll say 3 or 4. It could be 5, could be 2. It won't be 2. It'll be 3 or 4 or 5, most likely, which will at least have some analysis done behind them, traffic forecast, an initial environmental screening of community impacts and other measures of benefits and costs to get it down to a smaller set. And at that point, folks will be asked for comments again as to what should be retained for detailed study. It's literally called ARDS, Alternatives Retained for Detailed Study. That decision point probably will come early in 2019. Initially, we thought it was going to be late, maybe in December, and I know I worked with Megan to try to work up the time for the council schedule. Last communications I had just yesterday appears like it's more likely to be, for the coming before the planning board and the council, more likely in late January, early February, that time frame.
Glenn, when you say alternatives, when I look in the presentation, I see cross sections. Does that imply, well, this cross section for the entire, both highways? I mean, what's an alternative? I see cross sections. Why are they described as alternatives? I think there's confusion about that point.
Well, the alternatives, a fully fleshed out alternative would have cross sections, in other words, how many lanes and what types of lanes there would be in each part of the road. I think in the presentation that was made to the commission back on July 18th, which is the presentation I've included in the packet, I'm going to sort of abbreviate, go through it today. They said that it was hard for them to actually identify what the impacts would be, because although it might show 10 lanes or 12 lanes in this section, it may not be quite that in another section. It may differ bit by bit, piece by piece. Probably when they come back with the alternatives retained for detailed study, there still will be generic alternatives, but a lot of the preliminary alternatives will have been screened out. And then at that point, from that point on, for the next 8 to 12 months, they'll be fine-tuning those alternatives to the point where at least the engineers will believe they're reasonable, and then, of course, it's the judgment of the elected officials as to whether, and ultimately the governor, what's reasonable and what's doable. Well, and the next thing I'm going to do after another couple slides is to actually go through these generic alternatives, but I can almost guarantee there's been almost no engineering done on any of these alternatives, to at least when they were first proposed. They're totally generic.
They're basically function. Hi, Carol Rubin. I would just say this way on the alternatives that have been presented so far. They're really function over form. In other words, they have no idea how they're going to accomplish these, but it's how they want the road to function. Is it going to be hot lanes? Are they going to be HOV? Is there going to be transit? Those are the kinds of things that they're looking at right now.
And before we leap in, since Carol is going to be making a number of comments, I wanted to just briefly explain Carol's role. Carol has been wonderful as acting deputy director for 8 months. She has transitioned from that position. We do actually have a new deputy director who's with us today, Tanya Stern. You'd stand up, so you'll get a chance to meet her at a future date. But we were able to keep Carol in the planning department, and she is going to be a special project manager specifically for this project, and will coordinate not only planning comments but also the park comments, because that is the unique situation for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. We are actually property owners as well as a reviewing agency. We are affected property owners, and so she'll be coordinating with our Montgomery County parks and our colleagues in Prince George's County, because this affects Prince George's County as well. So Carol is going to be our go-to person on this project specifically. Just wanted to explain that.
If I can, let me go through the slides. And I'm not going to go through all of this. A lot of it is just not necessary for this presentation. And you have the full presentation in your packet, but again, I'm just going to skip around. The first slide that's on the screen is just the existing traffic conditions. As you know, things are really, really bad and have been for many, many years on 270 and 495. There's an average congestion. Severe congestion lasts 7 hours a day on average for I-270 and 10 hours a day on 495. And in the future, and by 2040, traffic is even going to grow by more, somewhere between about 15%. The 10 or 15%. The next slide I want to show is, well, here's the breakdown of the study that I mentioned earlier. The section in green is what's underway now. The section in blue, north of 370, will begin in 2019. The NEPA process starts with scoping and then a preliminary range of alternatives and screening. You see a star that says "We are here." Actually, at this point, the star should be to the lower right-hand side of that first box, because that stage is basically virtually complete. The public workshops have been held on these preliminary alternatives, and the purpose and need has largely been defined. There's still some more concurrent statements to be made, but for the most part, that's behind us. And the next real step is the alternatives retained for detailed study, which the state will be working on over the course of the next several months, taking these 15 or 19 alternatives, winnowing down to a much smaller number based on traffic analysis, based on a first cut at environmental and community impacts. Followed by the completion of a draft environmental impact statement, basically in about a little over a year from now, and then after that, a final EIS and record of decision in the spring of 2020. One of the questions that have been raised, is a good one, is where's the P3 sit in all this? The public-private partner. That partner has not been identified yet. There's a whole separate process happening for that. So what's really going to happen, I confirmed this with the state yesterday, is that really the state is going to carry this process through the record of decision. And at that point, they expect to have the P3 partner on board. And I asked the question, well, if the P3 partner is the one who's going to be asked to build and maintain this, who's to say that what you've come up with is something that they will want to do? And the response back was that there's still the opportunity to make further changes after record of decision. If they're relatively small, they can happen in design. If it's a major change, they may have to go back and do a supplemental EIS. So that's the response. The process, and this gets to the roles of each individual agency, there are various streamlining processes that have been approved by the federal government over the years, and within Maryland, one that's been approved is what's called the Maryland Transportation Environmental Regulatory Process, TERP. And the TERP process, based on the NEPA requirements, separates cooperating agencies from participating agencies. Cooperating agencies are ones that are supposed to work together to concur on purpose and need, on the alternatives retained for detailed study, and ultimately on the final alternative. Participating agencies are ones that comment. And so for example, and they work together, all work together in an interagency working group. This is the same structure that occurred under the Inter-County Connector and other major studies. That's not new. The cooperating agencies, the ones that have concurring powers, if you will, the local agency which is involved is, you see on the right-hand side, Park and Planning. And just as Gwen and Carol were saying, this is because they are the custodians of the parks, which these properties, these roads often go through in either 270 or 495. They both go through parks. And the other agencies are federal and state agencies, which are sort of the typical major federal environmental agencies. They're participating agencies. There's more of them. There are more federal agencies, more state agencies, and the two county governments, actually two departments of transportation, both Montgomery County DOT and Prince George's DOT. You don't see the county council in here, or county executives, or state delegation, because what this process is about is get the agencies to cooperate within the development of these alternatives. They recognize the elected officials are the ones who are, depending on the level whose project it is, are the ones that makes actually the decision as to what project goes forward. But in terms of preparing the documents, the alternatives, the purpose and need prior to that, these are the agencies that are involved. And one of the things that I encourage at the very end of this, and Mr. Berliner talked about this already, is that at the end of this conversation today, try to see if you can work out an agreement as to, whether it's today or shortly follow up, as to how the councils and the executives too, point of view on these steps along the way can be incorporated in Park and Planning's comments. And they're already doing that for DOT. DOT, again, is just a commenting agency, but Park and Planning is working very closely with DOT to understand its concerns, and when they provide, when they finally sign a concurrence document on various steps, they would be incorporating what DOT is looking at. So there's a lot of cooperation going on right now. Then, let's see. Now we'll talk about the preliminary range of alternatives. And some definitions first. There are general purpose lanes, which are just lanes that can be used by anyone. Managed lanes, which are set aside for vehicles that are distinguished by the rules of the road. So, for example, an HOV lane would be a managed lane. If it were a truck lane, it would be a managed lane. If it was a bus lane, it would be a managed lane. Then there's priced managed lanes, which involve also congestion pricing, which is you would charge more at the busiest times of the day, whether it's sort of static congestion timing like you have in the intercounty connector, where you say at certain times of the day, it's in the middle of the day, rush hours, it's going to be high, middle of the day, it's going to be medium, late at night, it's going to be low. Or it could be something like in Orange County, California, where it's dynamic, where it changes every 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the demand that happens. That's all yet to be determined. There's a lot more not yet determined than determined, obviously. Also, we talk about contraflow lanes. Here, we're talking about lanes that exist, which would be reversed. In other words, you take a lane that's heading eastbound and say, no, in the rush hour, morning rush hour, maybe it's going to go westbound, and vice versa. Reversible lanes is usually when you're adding lanes and you're running them in one direction in one peak and the other direction in the other. And then transportation systems management and transportation demand management are both minor changes, in the first case to the capacity of the road, in terms of the way the road is built, and second in terms of the demand that's using it. So an example that combines both, it would be ramp metering, because ramp metering, you're talking about maybe some changes to the ramps to allow for more capacity on the ramps, but it's also controlling the demand that's coming onto the road. And demand management also, of course, includes telecommuting promotions, preferential parking, road pricing, et cetera. Essentially, that innovative congestion management plan that's being built by the state right now on 270 is TSM, and to some degree TDM. It's a large TS7 TDM, but that's really what it is. All right, so now the alternatives. Again, these are very high-level, broad-brush alternatives. One alternative that's carried all the way to the end is the no-build. And we have 8 lanes in the Beltway now and 12 lanes on 270 in the lower part of it. In at least the section that this first phase study is doing up to 370. The no build, however, will also assume that 270 will have the innovative congestion management improvements in it. That's typical. When we look at a no build, we look at everything that's either existing or under construction or programmed ahead of the project that's being studied. The next alternative is TSM TDM, number 2. Essentially, that's being done already on 270 with the innovative congestion management. There may be some other bells and whistles that are added as a result of this study, but maybe not. More likely, the new ideas would come up in regards to the Beltway itself. And in fact, there have been studies over the last many years really looking at some incremental improvements of this type to the Beltway. They've just never come to fruition. Alternative 3 is to add one general purpose lane in each direction on each road. So going from 8 to 10 lanes on the Beltway and from 12 to 14 lanes on 270. Just one more lane each direction for traffic of any kind. Number 4 is a one-lane HOV managed lane network. It would add a lane on 495 on the Beltway for HOV. It wouldn't do anything, and this is alternative to 270. 270 would remain the same. Alternative 5 would add a one-priced managed lane in each direction on 495. This is essentially a toll lane. It could be a hot lane, but more likely a express toll lane. And to convert the existing HOV lane on 270 to a toll lane. So you lose the HOV lane, and it becomes something that you can only use if you pay a toll under that option. Alternative 6, you would add 2 general use lanes in each direction on 495 and 270. In the case of 495, you'd have 6 lanes in each direction rather than 4. In the case of 270, you would have 16 lanes instead of 12, but it would be split between the main line and the collector distributor roads. So it would be, you see the pattern there, 3, 5, 5, 3, with the innermost lanes of the general use lanes actually being an HOV lane. Option 7, 2-lane HOV network, managed lane network. Here you add 2 HOV managed lanes in each direction in 270 and retain one one existing HOV managed lane and add 1 HOV lane in each direction in 270. So essentially make it so that you're widening 270 by 2 lanes and the Beltway by 4, so that on both you'd have HOV lanes, 2 HOV lanes in each direction. Number 8 is 2-lane price managed lane network on 495. You can see add 2 priced managed lanes in each direction on 495, toll lanes, and add a priced managed lane on 270, retaining the HOV lane, but the 2 additional lanes would be toll lanes. You can sort of get the sense of where this is all going. It's just sort of mixing and matching various types. Number 9, 2-lane price management lane network, add 2 priced managed lanes in each direction on 495, and convert the existing HOV lane to a price managed lane and 1 price managed lane. So it's the same as 8, except in the case of 270, you're making them both toll lanes instead of retaining one as an HOV. Number 10, 2-lane managed lanes in each direction on 495 and 270, and retain an additional HOV lane. So now we're talking about 2, 4, 6, 8, 16 lanes again on 270. Number 11 is strictly only on 495, is to actually add collector-distributor roads on each side of the Beltway, and reconfiguring the lanes. So instead of being 4 and 4, it would be 3, 3, 3, and 3, which, including the space between each of the roadways is pretty enormous width, actually. 12A takes the existing beltway and says the inside lane in the off-peak direction. So let's say in the morning, we're talking about westbound in the center of the part of the county, that would be an eastbound lane. I'm sorry, just the opposite. The eastbound lane would be a westbound lane, and just the opposite in the evening. 12B, same kind of idea, but it's contraflow on 270 instead. The HOV lane, which exists only in the peak direction in the morning, when you have the HOV lane heading southbound, but you also have the inside lane northbound, which operates as a general use lane. Instead of operating at northbound as a general use lane, operated southbound as a general use lane, and then just flip it over again in the PM. 13A, add 2 price managed reversible lanes on 495. And you'll see in some of these options where it's just one of the 2 roads, the other one says they could include improvements from the other alternatives. So really there's a heck of a lot more than 19 alternatives. There's probably, 4 dozen that you could probably come up with. 13B is convert the existing HOV lanes to 2 price managed reversible lanes on 270. It means reconfiguring the road so those 2 lanes are together. You talk about a generic alternative. 14A, B, and C is transit. 14A, heavy rail, 14B, light rail, 14C, a fixed guideway, BRT, which would be in a separate alignment than 270 itself, given that these other alternatives could accommodate, and some of the alternatives could accommodate BRT on it, on the express lanes or the HOV lanes. No indication yet as to where this heavy rail would be, where the light rail would be. Are we talking about heavy rail north of Shady Grove only? Or are we talking about a separate heavy rail line? Very fuzzy at this stage. And then finally, the 15th alternative is a dedicated bus lane. Up to now, all the dedicated lanes are for HOV or HOT. This would be strictly for buses. So carpools, van pools would not be allowed. So those are the 15 preliminary alternatives and some sub-alternatives, and again, even within that, you see you can mix and match. And there's a various screening criteria that they will be using that comes down from the purpose and need, having to do with engineering considerations. Does the alternative accommodate existing traffic or long-term growth? Does the alternative enhance travel time reliability? Does the alternative provide an additional travel choice while retaining the general use lanes? Will the alternative include complex operating configurations that lead to driver confusion? Homeland security, obvious issues, but can folks move around better in the case of an emergency? Movement of goods, a very important part of any kind of a transportation analysis is, can goods and services be provided more quickly, and to what degree than can be now? Financial viability is one of the screening criteria. This is a real issue because, as you mentioned, the governor wants to have this all paid for with tolls. And so one of the questions that came up at the commission meeting is, why are we looking at all these other alternatives which don't have tolls on them? if the idea is that's supposed to pay for itself. Good question. But from a NEPA standpoint, though, you do need to look at all alternatives, and it is conceivable, I think, that they could go through the study, find that none of the alternatives are financially viable without some kind of, and I'll use the term from the Purple Line, availability payment to make the difference between the toll or the lack of a toll and what the P3 provider needs to be able to break even, more than break even, to actually make the profit it's looking for. Multimodal connectivity is still part of the study as to how to make transit better to a certain degree, at least. And of course, environmental impacts is a key part of that. The next step, really, over the course of the next several months, is, as I mentioned, screening these 15, 19, 40 alternatives down to a very few. The state's going to be looking at traffic forecasts for each of these alternatives, trying to figure out what the benefits are, as well as the a general idea of cost. They won't have a final cost estimate by any stretch of the imagination. Community impacts, how many houses, businesses would be taken, where they would be, generally speaking, not a final number by any stretch. What the environmental impacts are in air, water, noise, historic features, everything. And then by January, they will come back to us, to everyone, saying here are the small set of alternatives that we think are worth really spending a lot of time doing detailed study on. And that'd be a time for Park and Planning to comment as a concurring agency, for DOT to write a concurrence document because they're a concurring agency, for DOT to comment, for the council to comment, for the public to comment. There'll be public outreach there as well. So with that, let me, if I can, turn it over, unless there's any questions at this stage, turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about the comments that DOT has made to the state
Okay.
on the
We do have a
purpose
few
and
questions, so
Sure.
we'll begin with those. Mr. Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Orland, and thank you, Mr. President. You know, it's interesting, and timing couldn't be more perfect. As I was driving in this morning for my 52-minute commute from Germantown to Rockville on 270, and my wife, who I was talking to, who was trying to commute to downtown Bethesda, who ended up canceling an appointment because it took her an hour and 15 minutes to get there. We need to start quantifying the effects that the lack of action by this governor has on our constituency. And I'm sick and tired of the Up County paying the price. You know, it's interesting because I'm curious, did our Department of Transportation ever see a value in breaking up the I-270 study into two parts? Mr. Conklin?
No, and in our comments, we suggested putting it back together, consistent with the bi-county letter that was submitted. this
Where
spring.
is the largest volume of traffic coming onto I-270 from? Is it the northern part or the southern part, Mr. Conklin?
I don't know the data. My guess would be that the northern part's feeding most of the.
I've actually read the study, and it is the northern part. With the amount of development that continues to happen, not only in northern Montgomery County, but also in Frederick and in Washington counties, if we're not paying attention to our hardworking teachers and firefighters and police officers who can't afford to live in Montgomery County and who actually live in some of our northern suburbs and have to commute every single day down I-270, this governor is committing a sham. And he's doing it over and over again, and we continue to take it instead of calling him out on the fact of saying, wait a minute, I'm sorry, you're going to do a study that doesn't even have half of 270, the part where the traffic is, and therefore it's going to be okay, and we're going to assume that it's going to happen? This study is nonsense, and I think that it's important for us to really start calling it what it is. It's a dog and pony show for the governor to get reelected, period, and for him to say that he's actually doing something when he's not, and for us to spin our wheels and to make it seem as though we're providing comments for something that ain't gonna happen, just like the CCT, that again, robbed the Up County of any kind of multimodal approach, is completely disrespectful to all of the residents, not only in the Up County of Montgomery County, but also in our northern regions as well. You know, it's interesting because a Brookings Institute study on traffic talked about multimodal approaches. It talked about traffic. It talked about other kinds of transportation options as well. But the governor stripped out the CCT, one of our top priorities as a county, as well as we've for a long time said that there needs to be reversible lanes on 270. How long have we had that, Dr. Orland, as a recommendation for the county council?
A few decades.
I'm sorry, say that again?
A few decades.
A few decades. Folks have to wake up. I mean, seriously. I mean, we can go ahead and have packets full of data and information, but the reality is if we don't have somebody at the top who's willing to do the work, who's willing to say, you know what, that the people matter and that we're going to make a difference in their lives and make a change, all of this is for naught. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilmember Rice. Mr. Katz. I didn't skip anyone, did I? Were you next? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, I agree much of what Councilmember Rice just said. Obviously, the Up County has been shortchanged for many years, and I appreciate the update. I mean, we're not yelling at the people sitting here. It's the people that aren't. And of course, I've attended a couple of meetings where the state was there. I saw many of you there. And of course, I am disappointed, as has been mentioned, that the state is not here today. But, you know, when you attended the meetings, you didn't necessarily get any great information. I mean, Glenn, what you went through today is exactly what you see at these meetings. They weren't allowing questions from, in the larger group, they were only allowing questions at a round table type of a setting. And therefore, obviously, you don't know what every question was, and you can't sit at every round table with every group. But we've gotten very little information given beyond the alternatives or the options. And I know that the city of Rockville has sent a letter, or maybe more than one, but I know of a letter that are saying how concerned they are about whose home would be taken and whose home would be affected. And one of the meetings that I attended with the city of Rockville was that, or in the city of Rockville, was that people are very concerned that at this point they don't know they don't know if they wanted to sell their home, what the effect would have on it, if they wanted to remodel their home, whether or not what they would do if the home was going to be taken. Then we see in the newspaper or in the media that it's been said that they're going to only be using the current right-of-way, or what is now the current right-of-way. Well, if they haven't been able to come up with information, if they haven't been able to come up with the statement saying what they're going to do, how do they know that? I mean, so at some point, this, to Craig's point, the dog and pony really is not, they're not giving us information that we can even work with. And it's not fair to the county, it's not fair to the municipalities that are directly involved, and it's not, candidly, fair to the state of Maryland, the way that they're doing this. And then I guess the question has to be, are they really following the federal setup? Are they really following the criteria that the feds have set up for this type of discussion?
My understanding is they are. I mean, again, Carol can weigh in on this. And
We have problems with it. I mean, I just want to start off by saying that we are suffering the same level of frustration as was clear in Councilmember Rice's comments. It's been very difficult. And we're trying to work as much as possible with the process that they've established in order to retain our seat at the table, rather than just being pushed aside, similar to what they're doing to the county, the executive branch, and to the council. So we have the same level of frustration. So we're trying to get those a process. We've established a process. We're working with them, but the best that we can. We are bringing on a NEPA expert to help us with this. But most of our comments to date have dealt with their process and the deficiencies in the process and in the analysis and in the parameters of the studies that they're using, and it's a very frustrating kind of exercise to get them to move off the mark. But they are insisting that they are going and using the NEPA process. Just to be aware, the federal government, through an executive order, has established a 2-year process for NEPA. They've shortened it, and that's what they're hanging their hats on. So whether or not they're actually complying, we're challenging that, and I'm sure they're going to get a lot of challenge from outside sources.
Well, and I thank you, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but obviously the way that this is going about, we have a transportation problem in Montgomery County and in Maryland. We have especially in Montgomery County, but to pretend that this is going to solve it, and have they even come back and said that if you do alternative, fill in one of the numbers, how much of a relief this would give for traffic?
To address that particular question, one of our comments or concerns is that they
I guess you
haven't
still
even
have to
done.
comment.
I'm
Yeah, we're
sorry,
still waiting
I'll
for
let
him.
you-
No, we
They
jumped
haven't
in.
even, our concerns are that they haven't even addressed the basic fundamental questions of what is causing the problem. In other words, similar to what Councilmember Rice said, they just divided their study, and it doesn't make sense how they divided. We don't know, they haven't addressed origin and destination of travel. They haven't addressed whether it's through travel or commuting travel. They haven't addressed the patterns. So it's a very, as I say, it's a very difficult exercise to go through.
Thank you very much.
I'll hold if there's other comments.
Councilmember Florine.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Actually, it was me. I was the one who asked that we have this briefing in the T&E committee in July, and so I'm glad that we are taking it up today as our first item of business. We've been listening to the community this summer, and these are all, really serious concerns. I've got a couple of questions. One is, there are 2 projects, basically. There's this, and then, what are we calling it? The Innovative Improvements, what is it? The TSM?
Innovative congestion management. which
Innovative
are
Congestion Management.
Essentially spot improvements
Thing,
that
the
are
spot
underway.
improvements. So, do we have a map or something of what, have they resolved what those solutions are that they're implementing?
Not all of them. They're taking them one at a time. As far as I know, the only one that they've completed is changing the number of lanes going from 270 southbound onto the Beltway towards Virginia. But they're in process on many of the others.
Well, it would be handy to know what it is that they're looking at as we go forward. I think there is a certain amount of confusion about what is that initial thing. That was the $100 million
Right.
initial Band-Aid project, and then there was this bigger, and Mr. Garson has a nice map of it back there, so we'll
It's-
get a copy from him.
It's a design build project that they understand generally what each of the improvements are going to be, but the details of how each are designed
Exactly,
is
yeah.
still being
Okay,
worked out.
well, I'd like to see that. It's very frustrating for everybody that there were so many unanswered questions, but at least we're having this conversation. For Pete's sake, when I first ran for office in 2002, one of the first meetings I ever went to as a candidate was the I-270 study effort up, I think it was up at Seneca Valley High School. And that got shelved, basically. And that was, 16 years ago. So at least we're having this conversation. And it's frustrating for people because of the lack of clarity about the contours of it. But at least it's happening. I mean, this is our biggest problem for so many people. I was on 270 today, coming south, and the same, Mr. Rice's experience is a daily challenge for all those people, so many of whom don't live in Montgomery County, and the connection up to Frederick and points beyond is obvious, and the failure to be addressed, that they're waiting to address that start next year, as I understand, is really something. But at least they're dealing with the Beltway and 270 conversation, and that's something that we need talked about. Are there any? It's all spaghetti against the wall? I mean, are there any constraints on all this? Like, as with respect to right-of-way, and like, obviously, if you're gonna add 18 lanes to the Beltway, you've got a problem with where they might go. And so, I mean, is there is there any written limit to the nature of the conversation at this point? Other than what the governor said at a parade?
Not really. They'll be screening these against the screening criteria they establish, and
They'll
that's
throw
where,
the spaghetti up.
that's the filter for the spaghetti, the holes in the sieve, so.
So-
And if I could interject also through the Parks Department, because one of the concerns that we have is being able to address mitigation at a very, very, very quickly, and to understand what the impacts are from the park side to the parks resources, and a lot of other resources as well, but mostly the ones that we are owners, that we own,
well.
and that gets into our role. We've already started, the Parks Department has already started a worst-case scenario of looking at what would be the extreme decision, how that would, what kind of right-of-way that would require, and what the impact would be on the park's
I-
resources and historic resources as a start. And to start, we started to identify ways that could potentially be mitigated, but it's a very difficult process because as you, to talk about the mitigation for just one second is the ICC mitigation or park impact was 85 acres. Most of that was interior forest, and a lot of it was mitigated through replacement in the up county. And in this one, we're all down county. We don't want to do that again, and most of the resources that are being impacted are stream valleys.
Yeah,
You
it's very-
can't replace a stream valley
well-
anywhere. And so so we've at least started to identify the parkland impacts. Now, I get a lot of calls from people that are, as Councilmember Katz indicated, wanting to know if their house is going to be
Yeah.
impacted. We can't tell them anything, and I simply refer them to the state because we don't know what that outline. If we did an outline, it would be a significant impact, but that just scares people.
But, right, and that's the problem. I mean, it's some of these ludicrous options are simply that. I mean, and the question is, at what point will people know what to really focus on? Random comments by people, like no homes will be taken, is reassuring to some, but I don't think it reflects what SHA's current approach is. I doubt that that's likely to be what they're going to do or propose under any scenario. But are you saying, Glenn, that we will know in January what, like,
Their belief
a
is
functional set of possibilities would be?
they believe that by late January, early February, they'll have their proposed alternatives to retain for detailed study. Again, I'm going to say
How many would they be likely to have?
I'm going to say 3 to 5. I don't know. It won't be 15. It won't be 10, but it'll be a much smaller number than. What we
So
have
they
now.
don't have any criteria with respect to staying within the existing right-of-way
Not
for
necessarily.
any
Not
portion of this?
necessarily. I mean, it's likely that these screening criteria are going to weed out the ones that are just
Well,
not plausible.
I mean, we can all sit around now and
And so
say,
it-
that's not going to happen, that's not going to happen, but
Right.
it's scaring people.
Well, that's
And
what
it
hap- but
puts
that's the
everyone in a
process.
tough situation.
That's again, I remind you of 2003. 2003, if you look at a map, the ICC alternatives, it covered everything between 270 and 95.
Right.
Seemed like almost every house was affected. Everyone was
Right.
everyone was freaking out. Okay.
So-
but then they got to the point of having 3 or 4 alternatives, which then of course the people who are closest to those alternatives
you
really
know what
freaked
you're
out,
arguing
and
about.
everybody else got calm.
Yeah, yeah. So what we can tell the community is
Logical.
that by February, we should know what the argument or what the concerns are, can legitimately be raised at that point. And right now, it's a more conceptual selection of options. I mean, heavy rail, I mean, great, we're going to run a new part of the metro under the Beltway or 270. I mean, you know, it's just, some of this is just silly.
Right.
it
One
seems to
one
me.
of the things that we're
I was
actually-
blown away when I saw that as
Yeah, well-
an option.
One of the things that our team, and I can go over that with you if you'd like, but one of the things that we're trying to do is to take a much more proactive approach on the working with them on the alternatives for detailed study. In other words, we're not going to accept their drawings and their alternatives as those are the choices. We know that there's going to have to be alternatives to that. There's going to have to be hybrids. There's going to also have to be other things to look at. For example, I'm just going to, we've talked about, is there a way to change the toll structure on ICC to make more people use it during the peak season so that it could draw some of the traffic off? Or is there a way of looking at the CCT as part of this, adding it to this project? Say if you're getting a concessionaire in, can you add extra years onto the concession?
Oh, yeah.
And just get them to pay for and get some of their
Well,
revenue
that-
from the CCT,
That-
which also could draw some of the traffic off of
That
of
CCT add-on
270.
has been talked about.
Right.
yeah.
In other words, we're trying to get the state to look at this not as a holistic transit solution based on land use, on land use practices, which is to spread the traffic, not to just keep throwing it at one place. And that's our primary goal. So we're actually meeting tomorrow as a team to start looking at those alternatives, taking what they've provided, adding to it, thinking of what other things we could pull out of kind of other solutions, other master plans that we have, that you all have approved throughout the area that they haven't even considered.
So you're getting that in before they set
That is
their
our goal,
alternatives.
yes.
Well, that's a good thing. I applaud that. I do think the one thing, we do have to have a little reality check issue here. This is a national road. If you ask me, we don't have enough internal infrastructure for our residents so that, 270 and the Beltway are required locations for our residents to use to get from point A to point B in many cases. But it's also the way you get to the center of the free world, such as it is right now. And the way you get from Boston to Florida in your car. I mean, it is a national road as well. And so it's not just us, which is, I think, part of the community challenge, because it serves so many functions. And so I do applaud the fact that this is occurring. I know it's really hard. And I think the biggest thing for us the most important thing that we can do is to share with the community what the points of decision are, and when we will know what, if you're going to have a coalition, let's focus on something clear that we can have a conversation about, so you don't spin your wheels before you really have a point of debate. Hopefully, some of those points will be resolved. We're not going to take Holy Cross Hospital down. How are they going to? They're going to relocate the CSX bridge. I mean, there are things here that just seem to me to be such evident constraints as to their options that we may be left with what we've always been left with, unless there's some creative lane management program that can be put into place electronically within the existing right-of-way. But knowing what the contours of all that might be is going to be the most important thing for the state to alleviate community concerns and help us all focus on what's doable. So thank you for your work so far, and I think it's up to the council and the future council to expect a kind of regular briefing on this as you go forward, because of course you're expected to know the answers to all these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Elrich.
Yeah, one of our problems is going to be figure out where our action points are aside on briefings. I don't want continuous briefings on a descent into a very unpleasant project, because that will just be one depressing moment after another. I've been driving the Beltway in 270 just to look at what options might look like, and I've had a conversation with State Highway and with the state's representative at TPB. about, at least on 270, they could gain a lane tomorrow by taking away the inside service lane. They don't have inside service lanes on all roads. And they could take away the inside service lane and fix the drains are only a problem because they kind of dip down and cars would hit the drain and do funny dips. But that's an easy thing to fix, and that and paint. And the same thing with the spur going toward the bridge. You can gain a lane pretty easily if you want to gain a lane pretty easily. And that could be the HOV lane, and then they would gain a regular lane in traffic. And it may not solve the problem, but it's another full lane with, a fair amount of capacity. But, I was always bothered by, going back to when we did take a position on the reversibles, that the state even then had stopped its conception of the project north of here. And so to me, all you would do is speed people to the point in the road where it chokes anyway. And it seems that, one, you have to deal with the American Legion Bridge, which becomes a choke point all the way back that affects anything you do to the north, just speeds people to a point where they're not going to go anywhere. So that seems like a critical thing to deal with as part of any plan. I mean, otherwise, you're not going to gain what you need to gain. And you have to deal with what happens when you get off either the Beltway or I-270 because, despite some, efforts to double load the exit ramps in places, the lines seem to back up as far as they did before. And our problem is if we can't get the roads flowing in any way in the interior of the county, or like at least off the highways, then you're just, again, speeding people to a point from which they will not be able to make any kind of progress. And so it would be good if they were looking at this holistically and recognizing that you kind of got to start from your choke points and figure out how do you deal with them and work backwards upstream rather than starting upstream and leaving your choke points in place. And I feel that, they've got to take a broader look at this, and I hope the state looks at just adding the lane on I-270 right now. You can't do it on the Beltway, at least not beyond the rail bridge. And at that point, there's not enough room to add anything. But before the rail bridge, there's actually room to probably grab enough space to add a lane on the interior. And the bridges are a problem. The bridges are a problem on I-270, where any of these widenings would pretty much require you to take out existing bridges. They're rebuilding the Surrender, or the bridge next to Surrender Dorothy, or Surrender whoever is being surrendered right now. And that bridge they're rebuilding is right up to the service lane, and so you couldn't put anything under that. And here they are talking about a mega project and redesigning a bridge that they would have to then tear out and do over again. And the CSX bridge is a whole other problem because that's not going to be quick. And how long are you going to disrupt East Coast traffic on the MARC line and wherever else it does while you deal with that? It seems really poorly thought out. It does seem very political. A nice thing to roll out now, but not really effective. So, I hope we'd continue to raise issues about other things that matter, and hopefully get a governor that'll take a holistic approach at what we're dealing with here. Because I share a lot of people's concerns that this will just move backups from one place to another, but not necessarily make any improvement. Now, I understand that along Rock Creek, through the famous S-turns, that there were limits on how far, going back to when the Beltway was built, how far you could go over there. Do we know what was originally agreed to? What are the limits of how far we can go? Yeah, how wide?
Matt Harper with Montgomery County Parks. We had dug up some old agreements with when the Beltway was originally built, and they said it wouldn't expand beyond one or two more additional lanes, and we've already surpassed that. So that's already out of date, and that's the agreement that we currently
So
hold.
we're at the limit of what they could have done by the agreement.
According to this agreement, but I think we've exceeded it already. So I'm not sure how relevant it is at this point, but clearly there's no room in a lot of places to go any further without actually ending up on top of the river.
Yeah, I don't see how through parts of that you get away without having really serious stream impacts. I mean, that, and if to the extent we've got a legal hook, we ought to try to look at the legal hook, not just you can't expand beyond, but what were the reasons that you couldn't expand beyond? Because if they delineate what the purpose of the limits is, at least it gives us something to say you're violating the purpose of the limits.
Right, and many portions of the existing beltway are still actually deeded to M&C PPC. So they were never actually transferred over to SHA right-of-way, so they are officially under, M&C PPC property ownership.
Gee, how strong is that ownership?
Okay, so that was one of the, when we talk about roles,
Yeah.
my take, and I've actually confronted the state representatives about this, is the reason that Park and Planning is listed as a cooperating agency, which is a level above a participating agency, is because of our land ownership. Although we're listed as a local agency, as you all know, we've told you over and over, we're a state agency. So what that means is that they don't have the same power of eminent domain against property owned by Park and Planning that they do against property owned either by the local government or private individuals. So there's been a question whether they have any rights of eminent domain. We've done the analysis of it, and we're looking at it, and that's one of the likely reasons, so that they're going to need our cooperation in acquiring any of that property. So it's not as simple as, we need this parkland, we're going to take it. It's not going to happen that way. So that's our leverage, and we use that actually successfully in the ICC when the state didn't want to do all of the mitigation that we were asking them, because the county's mitigation requirements are different. We're stricter than the state's on forest conservation. So we actually held up the deed until they complied with the restrictions with the replacement of parkland that we wanted. So that's our leverage. We believe that's the reason that we're a participating agency. But I just want to make, if it hasn't been, hammered in, we are collaborating very closely with DOT. We're collaborating very close, actually, with National Capital Park and Planning, because a lot of the property they need is covered by Capper-Crampton, which means they need federal approval to have a change in use. So there's a lot of very, very difficult legal reasons that it's not going to be as simple as just saying we need this and we're going to take it. So, and we're incorporating theirs into our comments. So essentially, it makes MCDOT a cooperating agency in that regard.
That would be a good time not to cooperate then. I mean,
Well, we don't really like that term, but I just want to make it clear that what that means is we have a choice of concurring with comment, which means a concurrence with comment. If we basically say we oppose it, we're not going to concur, we lose our ability to get any of our comments into the record of decision. If we concur with comment, then our comments make their way into the record of decision. So it basically says we don't agree with this. And what that does is it basically puts on the table for the partnership, for the concessionaire, they can't ignore it. They can't say, oh, we didn't know that you were going to require this. It's in the record of decision. So essentially, we really need to get to a concurrence with comment at some point. We have a meeting with Federal Highway at the end of the month because they're really pushing for us to get there. So if we end up with concurrence with comments, that doesn't mean that we agree. It means that, all right, we can move forward, but on to the next process under NEPA, but you have to put these positions into the record of decision so that they're addressed at some point moving forward.
do you retain the right, say at the end, to ultimately not give them deed to property that's owned by the parks then? Do you surrender that if you concur?
No, it's a completely separate question.
So if you don't get a solution that sufficiently protects the stream, then you have the ability to say,
You're not getting our
You're not
land,
getting
and
our
it's
land.
it would be a rather lengthy legal process for them to force us to turn the land over or to try to condemn it. There's a couple legal issues in there, and I really don't want to talk about that.
Right.
But I think the reality is that, we're sort of going down the adversarial path here. The reality, I think we all acknowledge, is there's a problem of traffic on these roads, and there should be a holistic evaluation of how to solve that problem. And I think that, I'm hoping that we are not going to enter into this just, the folks who say no, 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 but that we are basically going to be saying, have you looked at multimodal solutions? Have you looked at other uses of the existing paving? Have you figured out some ways to improve the traffic situation, yet not have devastating environmental and community impacts? So I don't want to,
Right.
derail the conversation that you were having, but I do think, we're trying to go into this and say it's not just as adversaries. Let's see if there's a way to turn this project into something that will find some solutions.
Yeah, it seems to me that that I-270 offers an easy way for us to say yes to additional traffic solutions without yes to widening. Because if they do the reversibles, we can accomplish that within what's there without having to do widening. And I think ultimately people, what they really want is the traffic solution. They don't particularly care if the thing's widened, and lots of people do care if the thing is widened. And I think for all of us, I mean, I've been reminded of this and having commented on this with people, not supporting widening is not supporting the solutions that we know we can implement that are actually, I think cheaper to implement. So I hope that that we all kind of remember to say both things, because that's important. I don't want to engender people thinking we don't want a solution to the I-270 mess. I want to say one other thing about the transit, and then I see you wanted to make a comment. If this were going through a city, if I-270 was going through a city or the Beltway was going through a city, you can make a stronger case for mass transit option. But a mass transit option that is either under or on the Beltway doesn't stop at places that facilitate actually picking up passengers, which the whole point of the transit option would be to take people off the Beltway. So the transit option may not be as simple as saying, let's just put something up the middle of I-270 or let's put something on the side lane. You may actually have to look at where are the people coming from to get onto I-270 and intercepting them before they get there as part of a transit solution, rather than just looking at, can I put it on the I-270 roadway? And I think the state should be reminded that the solution may lie elsewhere to the problem they're trying to do in reducing ridership on I-270.
Thanks. Chris, did you want to respond?
I don't want to interrupt your conversation, but I have comments to make
Yeah.
whenever it's appropriate. I just wanted to reinforce the importance of making the right comments at the right time in this process, and that's what we've been collaborating with the Commission on. And right now, the documents that are ripe for decision-making are the purpose and need. And the efforts that have been made by the county and the Commission on that is to make sure that that purpose and need is broader than what's been framed by the state, which is purely around the highway need. And it's not questioning the highway need, but it's suggesting that the range of solutions needs to be broader than that. The other element that is really on top of mind for where this process will go are the screening criteria. And again, I don't know if I don't think the Commission has submitted their formal comments yet or not, but it's really important that those criteria be balanced and include some things that are missing from the state's preliminary assessment of that, related to social equity and how different types of alternatives will be evaluated in those. For example, on Homeland Security, we had suggested that facility redundancy might be an important criteria for them to consider in screening alternatives for that. And I did want to mention, we are working closely with both Prince George's County DOT and sharing our comments and the Commission, and we have engaged, the City of Rockville has asked us to engage with them, and as we have. We have not with Gaithersburg, given that those study limits are not in Gaithersburg at this time, really. But we are happy to come to talk to you about the comments that we're submitting through this process, although they don't necessarily carry the same weight as those the Commission has.
To that point, and then we'll keep moving with council members, the initiation of this discussion today was substantially to established that we want to have a unified voice here, and the county council would like to, be able to weigh in, to put it gently, as to what the comments are. So what's the process for that? Maybe, Glenn, can I ask you to help us understand, how does the council kind of establish what the county's position ultimately is?
Well, we could ask that Park and Planning and DOT share their draft comments with us. They have sort of a long way anyway. We can share it amongst you all, and whether it's formal or informal, pass on those comments back to them. The comments really have to come from Park and Planning.
Right.
Because they're the agency that has to concur. I mean, comments can come from DOT as well, but it's stronger if it comes from Park and Planning.
It's our intention to always submit our own comments, given that we're a participating agency, and they're likely to
You will
be-
submit as your
Yeah.
participating agency role, and Park and
Exactly.
Planning has its, what was the name of the? Collab,
It's a cooperating agency.
cooperating
But
agency.
we are actually
voice.
incorporating, as I say, we are incorporating DOT's
Sure.
comments into ours.
So we just want to be
So
sure
that
that
gives them,
we are incorporating
Yes.
ours as well, so
we'll
I
have
think
to,
we're
I'll
all.
work with Glenn, we'll work with Glenn
yeah.
and figure out a process for
We could-
that.
Yeah, exactly. Let's work it out. But whatever we get as draft comments, we could circulate and get your comments.
Terrific.
Informally. I don't know if we have, I sort of agree with Mr. Elrich. I don't know if we have to have meetings on every point you have to make a comment on something. You will need to have, the body will need to meet in late January, February, to talk about the ARDS though, because that's a major decision point.
Talk about
The alternatives retained for detailed study.
Right.
Whether you agree
The,
with those
the
or not.
purpose and need comments are significantly overdue. As I said, we have a meeting already set up with Federal Highway and the state highway agencies to try to reach a conclusion on, they've had our comments, they promised to get responses back to us this week so that we can evaluate them and come to the table, kind of come to a conclusion of where we can agree, where we can't agree, and then the idea was that we were going to come back with that, and they say, well, let's see how far we can get on what would be a staff recommendation to the commission. The question is how we get, in a timing perspective, how we get that, the council's kind of into that same process. So if we can we'll work through Glenn to make sure that that happens, because of course we don't want to agree on something that would be contrary to what the position that this council would have. But if we have a comment that is not being addressed and that we're saying, okay, this is something that we're not agreeing on, but it should be in the ARDS so that in the record of decision, so that it's clear to the concessionaire moving forward to the next step, then I think we're in a good position.
Okay. Mr. Hucker.
Thank you. So just to spell it out for people watching at home, you won't send any comments on either the screening criteria or the purpose and need to the state without our input
No, we've already done that, actually. We've sent all of our
in
comments
the future.
on both, but with regard to the ARDS, we can coordinate and make sure that
That
happens.
would be great. Great.
Yes.
Great. Thanks.
Can I say the marked up comments from Park and Planning are in the packet? What you see there is purpose and need that was put out by the state, and then the redlining are the comments that Park and Planning has added to it. And earlier in the memo, you see a memo from Chris basically saying what the purpose and need comments from DOT are, and
Right.
they're all pretty consistent with.
Right.
Yes,
No.
and we also sent, there's a cover memo that outlines the major problems, so that, they're looking at it from a 30,000, from 20,000, and then right on the ground. We promised them red line, so they could put it right into the document, hopefully that they'll do that. But some of the comments can't be addressed that way, because we're basically saying that some of their studies were deficient, some of their analysis is deficient. So you don't, so that's gonna end up being a comment that we're gonna have to put in the record of decision.
Right. No, I appreciate that, and I agree with Mr. Conklin's assessment that those are the two areas of engagement for this council, and I really want us to be on the same page going forward. Dr. Orland, since you mentioned the council's limited role in this whole process at the beginning of your comments and the standing Park and Planning has as a cooperating agency. Let me just ask, did we invite our State House and Senate delegation to this briefing at all?
No, I did not.
And what about our state government relations staff?
They know this is happening, but I didn't specifically invite them, no. I knew we'd, I knew we'd run over, and we haven't even gotten to their comments yet. So the more people, sometimes it'll
Sure.
take more time, so.
Well, not everybody, I want them to be apprised of all these
Sure.
and have a forum to get their questions answered. I mean, to me, obviously the chair of our T&E committee, the House, the delegates, and many members are from this county. We have a whole committee that oversees park and planning, and we have very talented people involved, and I think, and they have limited staff. They won't meet again formally until January.
Right.
We have outstanding staff working on this. I think it's really important for us to all work as a team going forward and get them really prepared to and aligned with us and prepared to to use all the levers of power that they have and articulate the Montgomery County outlook on this as we approach the General Assembly.
Right.
In 2019. So, I know this is an inconvenient time for most of them at 9:45 in the morning on a Tuesday, but we could schedule an additional briefing on this where they could get their questions answered and we could all get aligned, especially in advance of the comments that an agency that they regulate will be submitting.
If
That's
I
my
could
second.
also comment that, as Gwen indicated earlier, we're also coordinating very closely with Prince George's County because we're a bi-county agency.
Sure.
So we have my counterpart in Prince George's County who's coordinating with their planning department, their parks department, and they're briefing we're briefing the full commission, and they're keeping their delegation. So they're running a parallel course. So we have power in numbers. It's not just Montgomery County.
Agreed.
It's Prince George's, and it seems that most of our general statements, although our land use planning's a little bit different, where our land uses are a little different, the overall concerns that we have is consistent between the two counties.
Absolutely. And so I think we're on the same page. We should get them in the arena and engage with us, and I'm sure many of them already feel like they are, but if I were them, I'd be concerned about us having a briefing and getting these questions answered at a time when either, it's inconvenient for them and they're not invited to it. Let me return to a topic Ms. Florine opened up and we've commented on. I appreciate the fact that Secretary Ron came here and spoke to the committee months ago and said there won't be any details for a long time, and I appreciate the fact that he said we're going to bring in the best minds of the country to look at this vexing problem. But that only goes so far. They obviously, whatever solution the best minds come up with, they have to conform to federal interstate standards and to Newtonian physics, really. And I can't figure out where 4 at-grade lanes go in the current right-of-way, which is the promise of this whole proposal, right? So if the governor has recently promised to not take houses and other private properties, to me, it's not very comforting to me or my constituents just to say, we'll know more details in February, so sit tight. So Dr. Orland, what's the width of the current right-of-way on 495?
The width of the right-of-way west of the 270 west spur is 300 feet. The width of the right-of-way east of there is generally about 200 feet.
Around 200. And I know this has been, I've seen some debate on this. Can you point us to the document you're looking at so that any members of the public can refer to the same thing?
Just look at property maps. Look at tax maps that, like the Board of Appeals has a set of tax maps which shows where the boundary of the right-of-way is. And it shows 300 feet for the western section and 200 feet for the rest, generally speaking. It flares out at certain places at interchanges and such. But typically
If
that-
you could maybe send us all a link, or we could publicize a map for the public to
I'll
look
see
at,
what
I think that would be really.
see what I can do.
Because there are a lot of people worried about this topic. So are there homes or private property within the existing right-of-way?
No. Within the existing right-of-way, no. Not that I know of.
No, and we have it on our GIS, so it's available on our website to see through our GIS system what the existing right-of-way is, and we could, we could overlay anything if we can always add a
That'd be
layer
the
if
better
we
way of
need
doing
to.
it.
So, but there is on our website, through our website, you can see what the boundaries of the of both highways are.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I mean, 12 feet, 12-foot lanes, 12, and there were there are 12 lanes. That's 144 feet. Plus, you have to add the dividers between each of the sections of roadways. Plus, you have to have some area beyond the edge of the right-of-way. And, of course, at interchanges, you have ramps. So is it possible to fit 12 lanes within 200 feet? Very, very doubtful. I mean, if it's to happen at all, it would be a situation where you have retaining walls right at the boundary line, and you're building balls to the wall all the way out to those walls. Constructability, I think, would be almost impossible. I mean, you talk about replacing, Mr. Elrich mentioned replacing all the bridges. You have to replace the ramps. You have to, there's, where the connecting points are going to be are key. I think it doesn't seem plausible to be able to add that many lanes on 495. 270 is a little bit different. The right-of-way is wider and in some sections, and as we pointed out, north of 370, it's really still be very expensive, but it still would be possible to certainly add 2 lanes. That's why I got the floor. In terms of Mr. Elrich, the idea of taking away the inside shoulder, it's got pros and cons. A lot of places have done it. A con is that it's a breakdown lane. If a car breaks down, it can go there. And also, that's where the police enforce the HOV as they pull people into that lane. So, but it may be still worth it, maybe better overall to actually use that lane as a travel lane. But it's got pros and cons. That's all I was saying.
You can't do everything in your solution as a traffic solution.
Right. And Virginia for years has taken the shoulder away and used it for a travel lane, and again, has its cons.
We've raised this in committee, and I know you've been in touch with State Highway about that. And certainly there are trade-offs in terms of public safety. There's no HOV enforcement on the Beltway right now that you need to worry about, and the use of the left service lane, to me, makes sense. But I think clarifying where the right-of-way is and the GIS map would go a long way toward relieving some public anxiety. And then hopefully the governor will be true to his promise that we'll stay within the existing right-of-way. But my final question, Dr. Orland, is it was my understanding that part of the right-of-way around Silver Spring near Four Corners is as low as 180 feet.
It's possible. I mean, my recollection is it's generally 200, but it could be less than that. In certain, I haven't looked at every little piece.
Yeah, obviously there's a need to clarify that. Mr. Conklin, do you have something?
Just the construct of how the state will go about doing that. They're going to take the screening criteria, and the most infeasible alternatives will drop through that. So that'll give constituents some comfort. And then exactly the issues you and Dr. Owen are exploring will be what happens with the design evaluation of the alternatives retained for detailed study. So the timeline's longer,
but
than
not
you
for
would
months
want,
from now.
I don't think it's going to be forever until they know the most largest alternatives may not work in these sections.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Council Vice President Navarro.
Thank you. I really appreciate, scheduling this briefing as a full council briefing, because there is no doubt that this is going to be an ongoing issue, even beyond the general election, of great interest to our constituents. And so to that effect, I think it would be really useful to incorporate perhaps a link in our own website with some, describing really this process. I mean, there's just so much going on out there in social media, so much discussion, so much misinformation, a lot of anxiety that's happening right now. And right here, I think we have clarified quite a number of very key, important issues. I would say that it's very interesting that this governor is, going around making these statements, when in reality, you're peeling back the onion and realize that, there are a lot of very important components missing, such as this notion of the study of county. And so you can't say in one breath that you're so pro-economic development and pro-business and pro-private sector and quality of life when you are making decisions such as that. And so it is up to us to really be able to communicate a coherent message to our constituents. And I'm not sure that has, happened thus far. It's also clear that, this council going back decades has thought through a lot of these components. I mean, it is incorporated in a lot of our master plans. So I think that's also important, and perhaps it will give our constituents a little bit of, comfort to know that we have thought through a lot of these elements. But also appreciate the fact that, park and planning is thinking outside the box and really not just staying within, some parameters that I think it's also hopefully will be a comfort. So I'm just requesting that, we try to find a convenient place where the public can go to, and even us as council members and our staff, in case we get questions, it'd be great to just send a link or something to that effect. And then B, Mr. Orland, if you could also draft, some type of a timeline. I know we have the NEPA process here, but one that really does fit with reality, so that as we move forward, after the general election, new council comes in, et cetera, we can hit the ground running in scheduling briefings, so that everybody can, be on the same page. I think that would be really, really useful. So once again, just really appreciate this. I think it has really shined a lot of lights, and I do like the fact that park and planning does have some leverage in this process, and I don't think it's about, being conflictive in any way, but it is important to recognize that there is that piece, which hopefully then gives us more and more opportunities to chime in. So thank you, everybody.
If I can add, again, on Part B, this is the slide which has the process. The alternatives retained for detailed study, we should really, are likely to have those from the state for consideration, for comment, by early 2019,
Right.
late January, early February. And that is going to be a major decision point in the
Yeah.
study. And then after that, the draft environmental impact statement would follow about a year later. And
I think-
public hearings then.
Yeah,
Mr.
so,
Navarro's made,
no, what I was referring to, I think this is a great chart, but obviously, at least for me, after this conversation, it's clear that we should have almost like an annotated chart to fully understand.
well, like a public-facing
Yeah.
webpage. Let's
Yeah,
have
no,
DOT
totally.
produce something,
But
I
also
think.
kind of annotate it, because it doesn't seem to, this seems kind of general, but, anyway, so, yeah.
You can discuss amongst yourselves who should publish such a resource, but it seems like there should
It'd
be
be
a
great to have
resource
something, yeah.
for the residents of the county so that they can come and have a very plain explanation of
Yeah.
We
what the
have a-
process is and
We
where.
have a
we're-
webpage set up already,
Okay,
and most of it, a lot of it links to the state, but it provides as the basic information that we can. And when someone has comment, I ask them to comment just both to us, but also to provide it to the state, so.
And we'll look at adding
yeah.
some things to the
You-
website to have a very clear,
Bring-
user-friendly kind of timeline.
Yeah, no, because, again, I feel that through this conversation, we have clarified quite a number of things that I had not necessarily seen in any of the websites or, this general chart. So I think the public definitely appreciates some of the nuances that perhaps are not as, evident. So to the extent that that can be looked at, that would be super useful. Thank you.
all right. Now, we will turn to Park and Planning and DOT for a summary of important points that you may wish to add.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, DOT has submitted 2 comment letters in addition to participating in the interagency working group. The first of those concerned the purpose and need, and our comments were really about broadening the purpose to address mobility needs in this quarter, knowing that the highway congestion is a symptom of the unmet mobility needs that we have. To make sure that the purpose and need protects the existing HOV and transit opportunities that exist in this corridor, and to make sure that other options for transit are fully considered. You get some sense from the numbering of alternatives how the transit is viewed, and we want to make sure that it gets its full consideration. And again, the last item that we really referenced in the purpose and need letter formally was the expansion of the study area back to I-70 as had originally been announced, knowing that the needs north of 370 are just as pronounced as those south of 370. The second letter we submitted was on the preliminary range of alternatives and the screening criteria. And in that, the state, through the interagency working group, had suggested that they welcomed input on what might constitute the actual transit alternatives. So we gave them lots of ideas of what could be part of Alternative 14, heavy rail transit, light rail transit, and BRT. Many of those are projects that are familiar to you, like expanding MARC service, all-day service in the third track, some metro rail extensions for consideration. They may not make it through the screening process, given the cost and the limited market they might serve in addition to Shady Grove, but they need to look at those. Light rail alternatives that were 355-oriented light rail, and then other ones that were extensions of the Purple Line, which other plans have thought about, both to Virginia and east into Prince George's County. And then BRT alternatives, given the limits, we did not include the CCT in our first recommendation for BRT alternatives, since that is largely north of I-370, but did include the 355 BRT, the 586, 193 BRT corridor, the Randolph Road, North Bethesda corridor, and then some alternatives for BRT that are beyond the immediate county master plan, Tyson's Corner and elsewhere.
Yeah, your letter is on page 62,
It
circle
is.
62 of the packet.
And I'm trying not to just read it to you in the interest of time. We had suggested that, as others have said, there has not really been an analysis of what through regional travel is compared to local travel. And the state had investigated improvements to US 301 and I-97 as a bypass to the Washington region in the past. There's another possibility with work Virginia counties have been doing on Tri-County Parkway and extending that to US 15, which might also serve that purpose on the west. And then we made a large number of comments on the screening criteria, because this is really what will determine the alternatives retained for detailed study. Some of those were engineering, again, to move from car throughput to person throughput analysis, and accessibility to jobs and opportunity as some of those evaluation criteria. Elements related to safety, which is not directly addressed in the screening criteria, purpose and need. Facility redundancy, as I mentioned earlier. And we had suggested that or asked the state whether they only intend to consider toll-generated revenue to support these alternatives, or whether other possible revenue tools are available, so that some of the alternatives you've seen that aren't generating revenue might have a fair chance of surviving. And then the most important item we thought was missing in the environmental criteria was measures related to social equity and fairness, and how any toll schemes or other priced schemes might impact different economic groups within the county and elsewhere in their ability to use these facilities. And then lastly, as we've talked with the planning department, and as you've heard today, the characteristics of these corridors are not at all uniform. The elements in Prince George's County are very different from those in northern Montgomery County, which are very different from western Montgomery County, which is very different from 270. So we had suggested analysis segments that the state looked to see whether different solutions out of that wide range of alternatives would work in different pieces, and not try to cram the same solution through all of the two corridors, knowing that the constraints are very different and the needs are very different. So that's the summary of the comments that we provided. We shared them, as I mentioned, with Prince George's County government, with the planning staff and a few other stakeholders, and are happy to include county council on any other comments we develop in the future. However, I must say we will submit them within the comment deadlines, independent of what process we need to go through, and we can amend them later, but we want to make sure that whatever we have to say is on the record in a timely way, so that
When is
they're
that?
not ignored. They're different for each step of this process. So the purpose and need, I think the first two steps, the comment deadlines, have just closed.
And that's what this letter is right here.
Yeah, that's what these two letters refer to.
Thank you.
Okay, and the comments, parking planning, I'm going to turn it over to both Steve Aldrich, is one of our transportation planners, as well as Matt.
One moment, Councilmember Florine.
Okay.
I just wanted to compliment you, Mr. Conklin, on emphasizing the additional alternatives issue, the Route 301 and the Route 15 issues. I mean, that addresses the big problem, which Ms. Rubin alluded to at the get-go, which was the destination and well, however you characterize that. The Washington region is one of the few regions, if not the only region in the country, that only has one road going around it. And I think that's the problem that we're trying to solve. Most other jurisdictions have an alternative serious option for people trying to get around that major jurisdiction. So I just wanted to say thank you for raising this. I think the state really needs to start focusing on this long term. I remember going to meetings about this years ago when I was on the planning board. And of course, you know, there's always an issue somewhere. But at the end of the day, looking at 301 and Route 15 as alternative routes, beefing them up, and making that clear to the members of the traveling regional public would be a big advantage for everyone. So thanks for doing that.
Mr. Rice.
So again, I want to just reiterate that we have our Montgomery County Department of Transportation saying that our #1 priority for bus rapid transit, which is Corridor City Transitway, is not being transmitted to the state because the state and the governor have set limits saying that we're not going to consider anything north of 370.
That and the project already has its own NEPA standing, so those were the two components.
Set by whom?
The state MTA has been advancing that project. It's not concluded, as you well know.
Exactly.
It has its own course.
And so, again, I just want to be very clear about this because it's incredibly important that you have a huge swath that I represent who are not being served by this proposal, who are being left out and said that you don't count, you don't matter. So I just want to be very clear about this. And again, my frustration, Mr. Conklin, you know is not with you. I know where DOT stands altogether, but I want to make sure that the public, my voters, my constituents in my district know that what this governor is doing is wrong. They are pushing us aside and saying we don't matter. And I'm sick and tired of it.
And thank you, Mr. Rice. And to follow that along, we sent a letter, strongly worded, from the county executives and the council presidents of Montgomery and Frederick. And we were in agreement, our two county structures, that this study should go all the way and that it should be multimodal. And those are two major issues. And it's a shock that the governor would consider breaking this into two pieces and letting the second piece, just dwindle. So we need to get that back on track. Ms. Rubin.
Okay, I've had a lot of roles, but I haven't had time to get my engineering degree or my transportation planning degree in the interim. So I'm going to turn over the comments, the technical comments that we've made, similar to what Mr. Conklin indicated, to both Steve Aldrich, who is our one of the transportation planners and an engineer working from the planning department working on this, as well as Matt Harper, who is from the Parks Department, so that you understand the issues that they're focusing on as far as for the purpose and need. So, Steve.
Great. One thing I want to mention is that we have an awful lot of people working on this project, and as Carol mentioned, we are retaining a NEPA consultant to help us in that area. But certainly, what we've been focusing on recently has been trying to define the problem, essentially for the problem and the need. The purpose and need statement is a critical part of a NEPA process. We have some major problems with the way the problem was framed. Even just the title of the project, Managed Lane Study, most transportation studies start with a problem like congestion. The overarching title from the governor, the Congestion Relief Program, would have been a better title for this project. Because it's already, the title is somewhat leading. So you sort of get the sense that multimodal solutions may be off the table or may be excluded very quickly. So what we focus very carefully is trying to make sure that metrics that look at quantifiable objectives, look at multimodalism, are included in the purpose and need document, because if it's not in that document, it won't be considered when you screen the alternatives and when you look at developing the arts. The four main efforts that we identified, first was taking managed lanes and reference to it out of the purpose and need document and really focusing on quantifying the need. Where is the congestion? How often does it occur? Where does it occur? What are the causes of it? And how systemic is it on both roads? Certainly tying in the origin and destinations to these problems, what's causing this congestion. All of those, that a lot of data needs to go into it, but that helps to possibly define a solution. And the solution, as Mr. Eldridge said, may not be along the corridor, maybe someplace else. So until you actually look at this comprehensively and regionally, you can't really screen accurately what the proper solution should be. So we've identified the need for certainly more robust and measurable objectives, much more detailed analysis of the congestion. We will point out that during the ICC,
we had some very detailed metrics, things like number of hours of congestion resolved. And right now, we're just not there with the way the objectives that they're looking to screen are very general. And that just doesn't work and give us the information that we need to make adequate decisions. And the last of the four, I guess, overarching needs was that this project needs to look at things from an equity perspective. We need to make sure that we're looking at all our citizens and certainly looking not just at providing a lane for people who can afford it, but maybe we need to look at person throughput. Maybe we look at person served to make sure that the transportation investments are serving all our citizens.
Jay?
All right. Did you have something to add? Is that another presentation, or?
No, Jay Cole's going to speak from the Parks Department.
From the Parks Department, we focus on two major comments. The first, and for the record, we did work with SHA, and they have concurred on a lot of our comments, but we have two major sticking points from Parks' perspective. We've learned a lot from the ICC and the Purple Line and other projects coming through, so we're trying not to revisit past errors. The first was to have environmental stewardship shown as a distinct need in the purpose and need, as it was for the ICC. We ended up leveraging both the park's ownership of land and that environmental stewardship as a need into a significant environmental stewardship and compensatory mitigation package that we would like to ensure it is included in here. More important, because this is likely going to be a public-private partnership, so whatever's in the ROD, we need to make sure that whoever comes in as the partner knows that that's a distinct need. The other one is about stormwater management. The Beltway has approximately 631 acres of impervious surface, and I would say 90% of it is untreated. Currently, they have not committed to treating the existing stormwater management on the Beltway, which is a significant issue for parks, owning the stream valleys that it traverses. Just for reference, 630 acres is more acreage than Parks has impervious surface in our entire Parks Department, and we have our own NPDES permit. The significance of that is if it was built and permitted, then SHA, per their MS4 permit, that would be considered treated to the MEP, so they would never come back and put significant money into treating those stormwater management, those facilities. So that's an important process for us. We made that mistake with the Purple Line, and the Purple Line's deal or permit with MDE was that anything considered subbase that went down to the subbase was considered not new development. So there are areas that the tracks are actually on that aren't required to be treated. So you take a sidewalk off and there's subbase to it, it's not considered new development. So we kind of learned from that experience once they came in. So it's only significant widening. So we want to make sure that that's included also in the purpose and need.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the presentations that we've had today. This has been a very helpful conversation. We've got a lot of work ahead of us on this important issue, and we will continue to address it going forward.